It began in silence, the kind of silence that lives in the deep. Not the silence of an empty room or a paused breath, but the crushing quiet of 1,000 tons of seawater pressing down on the world below. In that place, light dissolves within meters, and sound moves like memory. Slow, distant, distorted by pressure. Somewhere beneath the black surface of the Sea of Okhotsk, the Cold War was about to change forever. It was 1971. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a rivalry so vast it had reached every corner of the Earth, from deserts to orbit, from jungle borders to ocean depths. The air was thick with the unspoken understanding that both nations could destroy each other at any moment. And yet, every move, every decision, was built on a simple truth. Knowledge was power. Whoever knew more about weapons, fleets, movements, or intent would always be one step ahead. For the Americans, there was one great blind spot: Soviet naval communications. The US could track submarines, intercept signals, even photograph missile silos from space. But the internal messages of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, their heartbeat, their orders, their private words, were sealed away under layers of encryption and geography. The Soviets had built their most secure communication line, not in the air, but under the sea, a cable system stretching across the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk. To the Soviets, the Okhotsk was sacred water, a private inland sea guarded by islands and patrol routes, shielded by radar, mines, and the watchful eyes of the Pacific Fleet. It was the perfect hiding place for their most important cable, a link that carried the voice of command between naval bases, missile submarines, and Moscow. They believed it was untouchable, but in Langley and Fort Meade, a handful of men started to wonder, what if it wasn't? Within the grey corridors of the NSA, analysts began piecing together fragments, hints from intercepted signals, discrepancies in timing, unusual frequency gaps. They suspected that beneath those icy waters lay a direct line into the Soviet Navy's most private conversations. The problem wasn't knowing it existed. The problem was how to reach it. The idea that followed was bold enough to sound like madness. Sneak a US submarine into a closed Soviet military zone, find the undersea cable, and install a device that could eavesdrop on it. All without leaving a trace. No satellite could do it, no spy plane could get close. Only a handful of submarines in the world could even attempt it. And among them, one name surfaced: USS Halibut. The Halibut wasn't a normal submarine. It had been built in the 1950s to launch Regulus cruise missiles, but by the 1970s, it had been reborn as something else entirely. A spy ship. It carried deep-sea cameras, sonar mappers, and mechanical arms designed for undersea recovery. Inside, engineers had installed secret compartments, advanced sensors, and experimental navigation systems capable of pinpointing position with uncanny accuracy, even at the bottom of the ocean. The mission briefing was simple, but the stakes were not. The Halibut would enter the Sea of Okhotsk, find the Soviet cable, and plant a wiretap designed by the NSA, a device so sensitive it could capture conversations without ever breaking the insulation. If the Soviets discovered them, there would be no plausible deniability, no research expedition, no cover story. It would be an act of war. The operation was given a name: Ivy Bells. Preparations began in silence. Engineers at the Naval Underwater Systems Center worked around the clock, building the tap, a cylindrical instrument roughly the size of a large barrel, sealed against the crushing pressure of the deep. It was designed to clamp over the cable like a cuff, using magnetic induction to read the electrical currents running through it. The data would be recorded on large reels of magnetic tape inside the device, which the halibut would retrieve on later missions. Every component was tested in secrecy. The crew trained in quiet, simulated dives off the California coast. Only a small circle of officers understood where they were going, and none of them could talk about it. Officially, the mission didn't exist. In late summer of 1971, the halibut slipped out of Pearl Harbor under a gray dawn, her deck crew waving at a horizon that knew nothing of what lay ahead. To anyone watching, it was a routine patrol, just another submarine vanishing into the Pacific. But the coordinates in her orders pointed to one of the most forbidden stretches of water on Earth. For days, the halibut ran quiet, descending into the black with engines muffled and lights dimmed. The ocean around her grew colder, darker, heavier. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and steel, the constant hum of machines, and the unspoken awareness that one wrong noise could end them all. Every sonar ping was avoided. Every move was calculated. As they crossed into the Sea of Okhotsk, the tension was physical. This was Soviet home water. Above them, aircraft patrolled the skies. Farther east, destroyers prowled the surface. Every moment was borrowed time. The navigation officer tracked their position using nothing but inertial guidance, a delicate system of gyroscopes and accelerometers that could drift by mere yards over hours. In that darkness, every meter mattered. The crew barely spoke. Meals were quiet. Sleep was restless. They knew the stakes. One blip on Soviet radar, one misplaced sound, and they'd be hunted down by depth charges. The ocean that had always been their shield could easily become their grave. Days turned into nights, though time had little meaning in the deep. The halibut crept along the seabed, scanning for the faint, unnatural shape of a cable. Most of the seafloor was lifeless, rock, silt, and shadow. But one morning, the sonar operator froze. Amid the static hum, he spotted something smooth and straight, too perfect to be natural. The captain ordered the ship to hover. The cameras extended into the dark. On the monitors, through clouds of drifting sediment, a line appeared, a pale, algae-coated tube stretching endlessly across the bottom of the sea. They'd found it. The order came in a whisper: "Prepare the divers." The divers suited up in near silence. Inside the submarine's narrow compartments, every sound felt amplified. The hiss of compressed air, the squeal of metal fittings, the dull thump of boots on steel. There was no bravado, no last-minute speeches. Just quiet efficiency, the rhythm of men who understood exactly what they were about to risk. Outside, the world was black. Beyond the hull lay a pressure so immense it could crush a man's chest in seconds. Yet these divers were the few who could function in that world. Navy specialists trained to work calmly where light could not reach. They were ghosts moving through liquid night. When the hatch opened, a low groan echoed through the ship, the deep, resonant sound of the ocean pressing in. The first diver eased out, tethered by a thin cable, his movements slow and deliberate. Within moments, his body vanished into the dark, swallowed whole by the sea. The cable stretched away into blackness, its surface barely visible under a film of silt. The divers followed it carefully, their lights cutting through the void like spears. They found the perfect spot. A stretch of line resting on a rocky ridge, stable and clear of debris. It was exactly what they needed. They carried the device between them, a metallic cylinder roughly the size of a torpedo segment, bristling with clamps and cables. It was heavier than it looked, and every movement stirred clouds of fine sediment that drifted like smoke. They worked quickly, guided by memory and instinct. No comms chatter, no wasted words. Every gesture was rehearsed. The first diver secured the harness. The second positioned the tap, aligning its curved surface perfectly over the cable. The third checked the seals, confirming the magnetic induction coils were in place. Then, with a twist of a lever, the device clamped shut. A soft, metallic click that echoed faintly in their helmets. It was done. The divers hovered for a moment, lights sweeping over their work. The tap sat perfectly, quiet, unobtrusive, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. They gave a thumbs up, signaled the surface, and began the long, slow ascent back toward the submarine. Inside the halibut, the atmosphere was electric but restrained. The crew had to stay silent. Jubilation could wait until they were clear of Soviet waters. The captain gave a single nod. Mission accomplished. Engines came to life in near whisper mode, and the submarine began to retreat, retracing its careful path through the seafloor terrain. No alarms, no radar pings, no sign of detection. The halibut slipped back into the Pacific and vanished into the open sea. When they surfaced days later, every man aboard knew they had pulled off something unprecedented. A clean penetration of Soviet territory, a direct tap into their most secure line. But none of them could speak a word. Officially, the mission never happened. At Fort Meade, when the data finally arrived, the results stunned the analysts. The tapes were perfect, crisp, clear transmissions from the Soviet Pacific Fleet. They weren't encrypted, not even masked. The Soviets had assumed no one could ever get close enough to listen. What came through those wires was pure, unfiltered command traffic. Patrol routes, maintenance logs, missile readiness checks, base chatter, even the mundane conversations between officers who thought they were speaking in privacy. For the first time in the Cold War, the United States could hear the heartbeat of the Soviet Navy, not through guesswork or satellites, but directly from the source. The intelligence stream that followed was unlike anything analysts had seen. It wasn't about single breakthroughs or dramatic secrets. It was about patterns, the cadence of naval orders, the timing of alerts, the subtle shifts in tone when something went wrong. It was the rhythm of the enemy's life. For months, the information flowed uninterrupted. The halibut returned periodically to replace the recording modules, each time entering the same forbidden waters with surgical precision. Eventually, newer submarines, like the USS Seawolf and Parsh, joined the rotation, each designed specifically for this type of covert mission. Inside those subs, the crews began to develop rituals, lucky charms, routines, silent prayers before diving. Each mission carried the same dread, that this would be the time they were caught. The Sea of Okhotsk wasn't just enemy territory. It was a trap waiting to close. The Soviets had sonar nets, patrol routes, hydrophone arrays, layers of defense built to keep intruders out. But somehow, the Americans kept slipping through the cracks. Every dive was a new gamble. The water grew colder as the seasons turned, and the margin for error shrank. Ice formed along the surface, sonar reflections became unpredictable, and Soviet activity increased. At times, destroyers loomed just miles away, their engines reverberating through the hull. The crew would sit in absolute silence, listening to those low rumbles, the sound of being hunted, waiting for the danger to pass. The taps kept recording. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Operation Ivy Bells became a rhythm of its own, a cycle of daring intrusions and quiet retrievals, of fear buried beneath professionalism. The NSA's vaults filled with reels of audio, pages of transcriptions, and analysis reports that reshaped how the US understood Soviet operations. By the mid-1970s, the operation was considered one of the greatest intelligence triumphs in naval history. The data it provided was invaluable. It revealed not just what the Soviets were doing, but how they thought. Their hierarchy, their procedures, their responses to crisis, all laid bare in the quiet hum of an underwater wire. And yet, as with all secrets, the longer it stayed hidden, the more fragile it became. The deeper truth of espionage is that the greatest danger rarely comes from the enemy outside. It comes from within. For now, the operation continued in perfect silence, a secret victory running quietly beneath the waves. But in the shadows of that success, a storm was already forming, one that would unravel everything they had built, not from the sea, but from the heart of Washington itself. By the mid-1970s, Ivy Bells had become one of the crown jewels of American intelligence, a triumph so secret that only a handful of people in the world even knew it existed. In the basement levels of the NSA's headquarters, behind multiple layers of clearance, analysts listened to voices that were never meant to be heard. Soviet admirals, fleet commanders, even base communications officers, speaking freely over a line they believed was private. Every whisper, every word, every pause told a story. The tapes captured the mundane and the monumental, equipment failures, ship maintenance reports, the occasional coded alert about nuclear readiness. Most of it was routine, but within those routines were patterns, details that, when pieced together, revealed how the Soviet Navy thought and moved. It was the kind of intelligence that couldn't be faked or intercepted through radio. It came straight from the source, unfiltered and raw. To the NSA, it was a revelation. To the Navy, it was proof that human ingenuity could reach anywhere, even into the heart of an enemy's most guarded system. But to the men who carried it out, the crew of the submarines that made those dives, it was something else entirely. A quiet burden they carried alone. Each mission blurred into the next. The submarines would leave Pearl Harbor or Mare Island under cover of darkness, their logs sanitized to hide their true destination. They would slip beneath the waves and vanish for months at a time, reappearing with the same silence they'd departed with. Inside the boats, the crews lived in a state of tension that never fully broke. The air thick with the hum of machinery, and the knowledge that one wrong turn could mean death or capture. The Sea of Okhotsk became their second home, a place of unbroken darkness, of shifting currents and eerie quiet. The men learned its contours by memory, its underwater mountains, its valleys, its cold, unyielding floor. They joked sometimes that they knew the Soviet seabed better than their own hometowns. But beneath the humor was a truth. Every dive took a piece of them. The missions demanded perfection. Each tap retrieval required hours of delicate maneuvering, bringing the submarine within meters of the device without touching the seafloor, maintaining total silence, while mechanical arms extended to grasp the recorder. The smallest sound, a misfired ballast valve, a tool dropped against metal, could give them away. Sometimes they could feel the rumble of Soviet ships above them, destroyers and patrol vessels tracing arcs across the surface, searching for anything that didn't belong. The crew would go silent, holding their breath, counting the seconds between sonar pings. They never spoke of fear, but it was always there, in the way hands trembled slightly, in the way everyone flinched at sudden noises. Still, they kept coming back. Each successful mission felt like stealing from the gods, a victory measured not in explosions or headlines, but in the quiet click of a recorder capturing history. Back in Washington, Those recordings shaped strategy, altered war games, and helped naval commanders predict Soviet moves months in advance. No one could know how the Americans seemed to anticipate them so precisely. The Soviets suspected everything: spies, leaks, satellites. But never once did they imagine that the betrayal came from the sea itself. By the late 1970s, the success of Ivy Bells had bred something rare in intelligence work: confidence. It was working so flawlessly, so consistently, that even the most cautious planners began to believe it might last forever. But nothing in the world of secrets lasts forever. The first crack didn't appear underwater. It began in a small, windowless office thousands of miles away. His name was Ronald Pelton. He wasn't a soldier or a diver or even a field agent. He was an analyst at the National Security Agency, a man whose job was to interpret the very intelligence that came from the Ivy Bells taps. By all accounts, Pelton was unremarkable, quiet, intelligent, competent. But like so many stories in the shadow world, his downfall began with something painfully ordinary: debt. He had filed for bankruptcy. His finances were collapsing. His future at the NSA looked uncertain. And in 1980, facing ruin, he made a decision that would unravel one of the most valuable secrets the U.S. had ever kept. Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. He didn't hide behind codes or intermediaries. He simply went in, sat down with a KGB officer, and began to talk. He told them who he was, where he worked, and what he knew. In exchange, he wanted money. Nothing extravagant, just enough to start over. The Soviets couldn't believe their luck. A man from the very agency that monitored their fleet, offering them the blueprint to their own exposure. Over the course of several meetings, Pelton revealed everything: the existence of Ivy Bells, the submarine missions, the tap on the cable beneath the Sea of Okhotsk, even the names of the vessels involved. He explained how the device worked, how often it was serviced, how the recordings were used. For a few $1,000s, he sold the quietest secret of the Cold War. Back in the Pacific, the submarines continued their missions as usual, unaware that their cover had already been burned. The next time the U.S. sent a retrieval team to recover the tap, something was wrong. The cable was gone. Where there had once been a neatly placed recording device, there was nothing but disturbed sediment and empty space. The tap had vanished, likely taken by Soviet divers. The Americans didn't need confirmation to know what had happened. Someone had told them. Within days, the operation was shut down. Orders came down from the highest levels to stand down all similar missions. The silence that had once been their greatest weapon became a tomb. The men who had risked their lives to plant and maintain that tap never spoke of it publicly. They returned to their families, to ordinary lives, carrying memories they couldn't share. The cold of the Okhotsk, the metallic scent of recycled air, the haunting sound of Soviet sonar sweeping the deep. In Washington, the fallout was immediate and devastating. Ivy Bells had been one of the most productive intelligence sources in modern history. Now it was gone, exposed by a man who simply needed money. It would take years before the full story of Pelton's betrayal came to light. He was eventually caught, tried, and convicted. But by then, the Soviets had already buried what he had given them. The Sea of Okhotsk became once again what it had always been: silent, empty, unknowable. Yet the echo of Ivy Bells lingered. It wasn't just the loss of a secret. It was the loss of an era, the moment when human daring met the limit of secrecy itself. The U.S. would go on to build newer, quieter submarines, more advanced taps, more complex systems. But nothing would ever quite match the audacity of those missions. The idea that men could descend into the enemy's backyard, clamp a listening device to their heartline, and leave unseen. The sea, as always, kept its secrets, but not all of them, because even in silence, the truth has a way of resurfacing. When the Sea of Okhotsk finally swallowed the last trace of the tap, the operation ended not with an explosion or a scandal, but with a whisper, the kind of ending the ocean seems to prefer. No headlines, no press releases, just a classified memo and a silence that stretched on for decades. The mission had lived in the dark, and it died there too. In the months after its disappearance, the submarines of Ivy Bells went back to routine patrols, their crews reassigned, their records sealed. The men who had risked everything beneath Soviet waters were told nothing, only that the program was over. Some of them suspected why. A few guessed that the Soviets had found the device. None of them knew the name Pelton. At Fort Meade, the rooms that once hummed with intercepted voices fell quiet. The analysts who had listened for years to the private pulse of the Soviet fleet were reassigned to other projects, other frequencies, other wars. The shelves of magnetic tape, thousands of hours of Soviet transmissions, were archived, labeled, and locked away. The great wiretap beneath the sea had gone dark. But intelligence work doesn't stop with loss. It adapts, it learns, and sometimes it remembers. Behind the closed doors of naval research labs and intelligence centers, engineers began designing the next generation of undersea surveillance. Systems that could reach deeper, record longer, and survive discovery. The lessons of Ivy Bells became the foundation for an entirely new branch of espionage, oceanographic intelligence. The technology pioneered in those dives, the sensors, the stealth coatings, the precision navigation, all found their way into future submarines and deep-sea drones. The same concepts would later underpin global undersea surveillance networks, fiber optic taps, and unmanned reconnaissance vehicles capable of mapping the ocean floor with surgical precision. The shadow of Ivy Bells never disappeared. It simply changed form. Still, for the men who had been there, no innovation could replace what was lost. That rare, almost sacred sense of having touched the impossible. Years later, some of them would speak. Cautiously, anonymously, their stories filtered through half-forgotten briefings and declassified scraps. They remembered the long hours of silence, the smell of hydraulic fluid, the cold bite of air recycled 100 times. They remembered the strange beauty of the seafloor, where their lights caught on silt and revealed the cable, that thin, perfect line connecting two worlds. They also remembered fear, the steady, quiet kind that never left them, the sound of distant propellers, the way everyone froze when the sonar operator's headphones picked up a new contact, the long minutes of holding their breath, waiting to learn whether they'd been discovered. But more than anything, they remembered the moment the tap clicked into place, that single, soft sound echoing in the dark. They knew even then that they were listening to history. Decades passed. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union dissolved into maps and memories. And one by one, the secrets of that era began to surface. Declassified memos, leaked reports, quiet acknowledgements of what once had to remain unspoken. Operation Ivy Bells was among them, whispered first in intelligence circles, then revealed in fragments through congressional hearings and investigative journalism. What emerged was not just the story of a daring mission, but a portrait of an age when knowledge was power, and silence was a weapon. When Ronald Pelton was finally caught, years after the betrayal, he showed no remorse. He spoke of money, of debt, of bad choices. but for the people who had risked everything to make Ivy Bell's work, his excuses felt hollow. He hadn't just sold information. He had undone a miracle. At his trial, prosecutors described the operation in careful, censored terms, never naming the location, never confirming the full scope. But those who knew didn't need the details. They understood exactly what had been lost. The Soviets never boasted about finding the tap. Officially, they denied everything. But deep inside the archives of their naval intelligence, the recovered device became a kind of trophy, proof that even the most guarded empires can be breached. Today, the Sea of Okhotsk looks no different than it did half a century ago. Cold, grey, infinite. Fishing trawlers cross its surface, their nets dragging along the same ridges where once, in total silence, American divers crept across the seabed. Somewhere beneath those waters, fragments of the old cable still lie, rusted, brittle, half buried in silt. The tap itself, if it survived at all, is probably little more than a corroded shell. But history has a way of echoing through time. The techniques born from Ivy Bell's, stealth navigation, acoustic masking, undersea mapping, live on in the submarines that now patrol the same oceans. Modern intelligence agencies tap not copper cables, but fiber optic lines, listening not through magnets, but through light. Yet the principle remains unchanged. Information is everything, and the sea still hides the best of it. What Ivy Bell's proved was simple, and yet profound. That even in the most hostile waters, the boundaries of possibility could be pushed by men who believed in what they were doing, even when the world could never know. And maybe that's why it still matters. Because beyond the politics, beyond the secrecy and betrayal, the operation stands as a testament to the strange duality of the Cold War. A time when human genius and human folly were constantly intertwined. The same minds that built the tap also built the weapons that could end civilization. The same ocean that kept peace through deterrence nearly drowned both sides in fear. In the end, Ivy Bell's wasn't about wire or machinery. It was about listening to the enemy, to the sea, to the heartbeat of an age when silence itself was the loudest sound in the world. The men who dove into that silence have mostly passed now. Their names are rarely spoken, their mission only hinted at in fragments of declassified history. But if you were to stand today on the deck of a ship in the middle of the Okhotsk, with the wind cold against your face and the sea stretching endlessly around you, you might feel it. That same invisible tension that once hung over the waves. Beneath you, 3,000 feet below, the ghosts of Ivy Bell's still rest. The divers, the machines, the wire, and the echo of words spoken long ago in the privacy of another world. And somewhere, in that deep and unbroken silence, the ocean keeps the last secret it was ever asked to keep.